I'm the first speaker, so just to introduce myself, I'm Maggie Simpson. I'm a socialist, feminist, anti-racist and anti-imperialist, and have been active in the labour movement and in campaigns during these last decades. Politics has been my life as we work to end the oppression of peoples the world over, and I'm very proud to support No Cold War, which I think is a truly international campaign. So, my contribution is really on the Trump impact on particularly China, but also Russia. And obviously the tariffs are sort of the major news of the day. Trump's tariffs campaign has confirmed China's position as the US's main adversary. The US approach to China was exemplified by the insulting remark from Vice President Vance: "We will borrow money from the Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture." And surprisingly, there's been great response from Chinese people who are outraged by that. China has led the world in its resolute response to the tariffs. Xi Jinping said China's development over the past 7 decades is a result of self-reliance and hard work, not favors from others. China does not flinch from any unjust suppression. I think it's been moving too that some Chinese government statements remind the world that China is a civilization of some 5,000 years. Trump's aim to decouple US-China trade, to rebuild US manufacturing, to try to turn allies and vassals against China have failed so far. The tariffs are causing turmoil in the US markets, will undermine US companies manufacturing in China, and will hike prices in the US. US imports goods and manufacturing inputs from China that cannot quickly be replaced. Goldman Sachs estimates that US GDP growth will fall from 2.5 to 0.5%, and that China's GDP growth will drop by 0.5% to 4%. Goldman Sachs always underestimate China's GDP, so that's more likely to be 4.5%, making the US even less competitive with China than it already is. And all of this will cause a major decline in living standards for the majority of Americans. US reliability as a business partner has been seriously tarnished by the tariff policy. This was underlined in a TV appearance by Trump's economic advisor, Stephen Mnuchin, who thinks that dollar dominance is great and wants the dollar as reserve currency to continue into perpetuity. To achieve this plan is for other countries to pay the US. And here are some of the options that Stephen Mnuchin gives. They can accept US tariffs without retaliation. They can buy more goods from America. They can boost defense spending with procurement from the US. They can invest or install factories in the US, or they can simply write a check to the US Treasury. I'll just note that Putin pointed out this week that US sanctions gave Russia no option than to find an alternative to the dollar for making its payments. China has responded resolutely to US tariff policies and has called out its aggression and bullying tactics and its breach of World Trade Organization rules. It has met each tariff implement with a light retaliation. It has halted export of all rare earth minerals, and it has a $760 billion of US stocks it can utilize if needed. China reciprocated to the 125% tariff, but added that given that US exports to China are already commercially unviable at this tariff level, any further US tariff hikes on Chinese goods will simply be ignored. And indeed, the US has had to sort of backpedal on some of the tariffs on Chinese goods, particularly electronic goods that it wouldn't be able to source elsewhere. Inasmuch as China relies on US trade, it will look for alternatives. Xi has just met with the Spanish Prime Minister, has state visits to Cambodia, Myanmar, and Vietnam this week, is in negotiations with the EU on abolishing tariffs on Chinese EVs, and a summit with EU leaders in July is being arranged. And actually, Britain has had a defence official and a trade official over in Beijing this week too. Putin has been stalwart in support. As he said, the US is 15 years too late. They will not be able to stop China's development. It cannot be done. Modi has been silent on the tariffs thus far, but India has recently said no to Chinese car giant BYD, while wooing Tesla to invest. Of course, if the US fails to contain China economically, then it will likely resort to military measures. Currently, military preparations continue, particularly around Taiwan. The latest G7 statement omitted any mention of the one China policy. The US is seeking to change the role of its troops in Korea so that they can be used against China. It is ramping up military aid to the Philippines. It is bolstering the second island chain defense with an eye on China. Japan is preparing to take 100,000 refugees from Taiwan in the event of war. And Silicon Valley oligarchs are working with the Pentagon to build new era weapons. The attempt to disentangle the US from the war in Ukraine so that it can focus more readily on China has faltered to date, as Russia is not prepared to accept a ceasefire with the status of the eastern region not even being discussed, and where there's the possibility of troops from NATO countries being part of a peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Both of these issues being key points being put forward by No Cold War. In this situation, Trump has failed to unite China and Russia. In fact, Russia has invited Xi Jinping to be its key guest to its National Day celebrations on the 9th of May. Right, so obviously Trump's affecting various areas of the world, and I think our speakers will reflect at least part of that. So first of all, I'm going to ask Francisco Dominguez to speak. Dr. Francisco Dominguez, a Chilean political refugee in 1979, was former head of the research group on Latin America at Middlesex University. He is National Secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign in the UK and an executive member of the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign and of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. So over to you, Francisco.
Thanks very much, Maggie. I'm grateful for the invitation to participate in this very important meeting. Given the constraints on time, I'm going to read a text, which I normally don't do. So I'll go straight into my text. Trump has intensified US aggression against Latin America, which mainly takes the form of expansion of its military bases in the region. In this regard, the US central justification, voiced primarily through the Southcom commander, is that US world geopolitical rivals Russia and China are maliciously interfering in the Western Hemisphere and taking control over precious resources such as oil, gas, gold, lithium, etc., thus unfairly competing with the US. Southcom commander Laura Richardson, through her tenure between 2021 and 2024, criticized the, I quote, predatory actions of China and the malign influence of Russia, end of quote, in Latin America, including the geopolitical dangers of predatory lending by China, Russia, and Iran. Richardson's predecessor, Admiral Craig Falla, that was in charge between 2018 and 2021, raised the same concerns many times during his tenure. Falla made 5 high-level diplomatic trips to Latin America, visiting Uruguay, Argentina, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados. Thus, the US has militarized its foreign policy towards Latin America by empowering Southcom commanders to issue statements on Latin America. In a statement to the Senate Armed Services Committee on the 14th of March 2024, Laura Richardson said the following: China and Russia are strategic competitors who operate without regard for international law and norms. They condone and perpetrate corruption, disinformation campaigns, cybercrime, and human rights abuses that undermine the existing democratic political process of fragile democracies in Latin America and the Caribbean, and bolster the authoritarian rule of regimes in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, end of quote. Richardson also accused China of using win-win, listen to this, using win-win trade and highly quality investment, employing the Belt and Road Initiative, BRICS, and other such seductive offers, such that by 2022, China becomes South America's main trading partner and Central America's second largest partner. In 2002, China's trade with Latin America was barely $18 million. By 2022, it has reached $450 billion and is expected to grow to US $700 billion by 2035. And on top of everything, 21 out of 35 countries of Latin America have joined the Belt and Road Initiative. On top of everything, Richard lamented that only 12 countries recognized that 12 of which are in Latin America. Sorry, 7 of which are in Latin America. Southcom commanders accused Russia of sending Lavrov to visit Brazil, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela with the purpose, and I quote, to increase cooperation with the countries it views as critical to creating a multipolar world where Russia, China, and others act as a counterbalance to the US, end of quote. Given the successful resistance by Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, the US militarization of foreign policy, destabilization programs through USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, plus regime change operations have targeted three countries as a matter of priority, but not neglecting any country that seeks an independent pathway, such as Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina, Mexico, and all of them. Cuba endures a 65-year blockade, which has included Trump adding Cuba to the state sponsoring of terrorism and falsely labeling Cuba's internationalist medical programs as forced labor by Marco Rubio. Venezuela has to endure several violent regime change efforts in 2014, 2017, 2019, etc., and well over 1,000 sanctions. And Nicaragua, in the case of Nicaragua, the extremely 2018 violent coup d'etat, followed by economic sanctions and effort to blockade its export to the US, is also part of this policy. Additionally, Southcom is militarizing the Venezuela-Guyana land dispute by all manner of military provocations, including false flag attacks on Exxon platform in Guyana, apparently in complicity with Eric Prince, the mercenary of Blackwater, with the intention to accuse Venezuela and justify US military action. Venezuelans refer to Irfan Ali, the president of Guyana, as the Zelensky of the Caribbean. The US has now at least several forms of military presence, including full-blooded military bases in many, many countries in Latin America, according to some accounts, 79 total military positions, expanding its military presence in Argentina, Chile, Guyana, and vigorously seeking to use the Galapagos Islands as a military base. The capitulation of Panama's President Raúl Molino to US pressure led Panama to abandon the Belt and Road Initiative and accept the possibility of the reestablishment of US military bases, which would be 14 in total. Finally, the CELAC, the Commonwealth of Latin American and Caribbean States Summit, recently has had several highlights. Number one, rejection to US sanctions against Latin American countries. B, Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexican president, made vigorous call to unity and regional integration, proposing the holding of a summit on shared prosperity and respect of our Latin American sovereignties, involving rejection of blockades and sanctions. C, Xi Jinping sent a congratulatory message to the CELAC summit, and an editorial article in the Global Times the day after denounced the US intensified 21st century Monroe Doctrine in Latin America. Finally, the CELAC ratified its desire to remain a region of peace. Finally, willy-nilly, Latin America, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Brazil, Mexico, etc., are in the forefront of the struggle for multipolarity, and therefore in seeking to follow a pathway of development with social justice and regional world peace. In this regard, Brazil joined China with a joint proposal for peace in Ukraine, for example. That's why Latin America has rejected supporting the US proxy war in the Ukraine, and especially is opposing and rejecting the US war drive. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Francesco. Thanks very much indeed. Okay, so unfortunately, our next speaker was going to be Amina Mangera, but I have to give apologies for Amina today. although she's prepared for the meeting, she suffers from various health issues, and sadly, she's been badly affected by them this weekend. She was due to speak on Trump's impact on South Africa. She often posts on this in the activist group, WhatsApp group, so do have a look at her posts there. So then the next speaker we have then is Sami Ramadani. Sami is a political analyst on West Asia and anti-war activist. Iraqi-born, Sami was in exile from Saddam's regime due to his political activities for democracy and socialism. Active against the US-led imperialist sanctions on the Iraqi people. He campaigned against the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, as well as against many other US-backed proxy wars in Western Asia over these years. He is a member of the Stop the War Committee Steering Committee and a supporter of the aims of No Cold War Britain. Over to you, Sami.
Unmute. Sorry, I was muted there.
Okay.
Okay. I have 6 minutes, so I will draw our attention to 6 points. I'll go through them rapidly if I could. The first point is regarding the war of genocide in Gaza, and that Trump's election has not fundamentally changed the nature of that war. So it's more or less a continuation of Biden-led imperialism. We've got now Trump-led imperialism. There is a kind of visual impact, visual difference in that Trump is much more explicit in the aims of US imperialism in the region, while Biden was more implicit than explicit. The nature of the war, and I refer here to an important article, which was an editorial in Monthly Review, the American Marxist journal, excellent journal. I urge everybody to subscribe to it. And in that editorial, they argued, that was even in December 2003, although the article appeared in the February 24 edition of Monthly Review. They argue that the war of genocide in Gaza has moved from its lower definition of genocide to its most extreme definition. And they would rather, and they argue through Marx and many other historical incidents, that this war should be called a war of extermination. And they go and explain the reasons why as to the nature of this war, the extermination of the Palestinian people, that the definition of genocide is part or whole of a population. And they argue that this is aimed at the whole of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Therefore, it's a war of extermination. And in this context, this is backed also by Trump's declared policy, which he pronounced 3 times, that Gaza should be emptied of its population, that Gaza is prime property that should be turned into a Riviera and so on. And he started immediately applying pressure on the 2 key states. If that plan is to succeed, he had to convince Egypt and Jordan. Both those states have resisted Trump's plan, and they are both very close allies of the United States. But the eviction or the forcible removal of the Palestinian people from Gaza into Egypt and Jordan poses an existential threat to these 2 states. And that is why both these states, and I say states rather than just governments or leaders, have opposed this plan because they would be faced with massive popular uprisings, especially in an Egyptian context of the spread of poverty in Egypt, a population of well over 100 million people, the extremes of poverty and class division is very, very sharp in Egypt. Within a Jordanian context, 60 to 70% of the population of Jordan are former refugees and their descendants, Palestinians from the 1948, 1967 wars, and later evictions, forcible evictions of Palestinians from the West Bank. They all moved to Jordan over the decades. So 60 to 70% are Palestinian origin, and any deportation, forcible deportation of 2 million people from Gaza into Jordan will definitely implode that country. So that's for Egypt and Jordan. One important development that happened in the meantime, and that has been sustained and supported by Trump, is the coup, the downfall of Assad regime in Syria. Syria is now practically occupied, divided into 3 regions with a very weak center in Damascus. The north is occupied and controlled by Turkey and its various militia forces backed by Turkey. The northeast is occupied by US forces plus some proxy forces led by so-called Syrian Democratic Forces. Is mainly a Kurdish force, which was independent but turned into a proxy force several years ago. The south of Syria is now being practically controlled by Israel. Israel has expanded, started invading more Syrian territory and are dominating southern Syria under the pretext of defending Druze ethnic minorities. In terms of Lebanon, there is a ceasefire which has been violated over 1,500 times by Israel, killing, murdering, using drones, refusing to withdraw from occupied territory, and so on. So Lebanon is precarious. Hezbollah, which was the main resistance force in Lebanon, is still quite strong, and it is leaving matters to the Lebanese state to assert Lebanese sovereignty over their lands. Failing that, they have threatened to go back to resist Israeli presence. Iraq is being subjected under very, very severe pressure from the both Biden and now Trump administration to cut off its links with Iran. Trump, following Biden's policy, is to isolate Iran. And Iraq, obviously, Iraq has 1,500 kilometer border with Iran, a vital state as far as any attempt to hit Iran, to destabilize Iran, to send terrorist groups into Iran. Iraq has always been a launching pad. Regardless of who rules Iraq today, U.S. presence is quite strong in Iraq. There are still occupation forces within Iraq, U.S. occupation forces. So Iraq has $150 billion of its reserves in the American Federal Bank. This is one of the outcomes of the occupation of Iraq. Oil sales go in dollars, go straight to the U.S. Federal Bank. So they have a stranglehold over the Iraqi economy, and they are constantly threatening Iraq if they don't cut off relations or links with Iran. There are war preparations against Iran, and Trump has openly said that Iran will be hit and that Israel will spearhead that attack. He actually pronounced that a couple of days ago, that it will be Israel, unless Iran submits to US demands on 2 issues. This is the surface issues, and I think there are more fundamental reasons, not even the question of development of nuclear capacity in Iran and the so-called prevention of development of nuclear weapons, and to stop and to scrap their missiles, meaning that Iran should become defenseless against any future attack. Iran has refused to include missiles into the talks. They are ready to talk about their peaceful nuclear program, but they will not listen to any Trump threats against Iran. In fact, they have declared that they are ready if Trump wants to launch a war on Iran. One important issue I want to refer to as well, winding up, I have 1 more minute probably. Maggie is pointing at me. Okay, I think this war in Palestine is a US-led imperialist war. It is a NATO war. They are the true backers, facilitators, and enablers of Israeli war of extermination against the Palestinian people. And Israel is practically the proxy force of US imperialism and NATO in the region, much like they do in Ukraine, whereby the Ukrainian regime and armed forces have become proxy force for NATO potential third war scenario over Ukraine. One final point is the role of the media and the BBC. I think this war in West Asia has proven that really the BBC and Western media are tools of US-led imperialism and other minor imperialisms like Britain, Germany, France, etc. And they are playing a leading role in keeping the truth away from the people of Britain and people of the world. Although it is hopeful to say that young people are more and more switching off from these main media sources, corporate media sources. And one very final point is regarding China and Russia. In the context of a multipolar world, I think China and Russia are very supportive of the Palestinian people, although they do have a problem because the Palestinian scene and the Palestinian resistance movements is divided. And that has put, for example, China, which had historic links to Palestinian resistance dating back to 1967. They had close links with Fatah resistance. They trained their fighters and so on. But the split within the Palestinian organizations has put some pressure on China and Russia as to how to handle the divisions within the Palestinian scene. Both Russia and China invited all Palestinian organizations to Moscow and to Beijing to unify them to represent the Palestinian people as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Sami. Thanks very much indeed. Right, so the last 2 speakers are going to sort of have a look at the impact of Trump on Britain. First up is Bob Oram. Bob works for the RMT and has been an active trade unionist for over 40 years. He is chair of the cooperative People's Press Printing Society that publishes the Morning Star and is an active member of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign and has been for 35 years. He says, I believe China is a great socialist country and the work of No Cold War Britain is more vital than ever before. So thanks to everyone who is involved and supports the campaign. Over to you, Bob.
Thanks very much, Maggie. So I've never really rated Rachel Reeves, and her spring statement speech was sadly as expected. When she said the Office for Budget Responsibility had confirmed real household disposable income will grow at almost twice the rate that had been expected in the autumn, and households will on average be £500 better off under this government, it was clear just how bad she really is. That fantasy was corrected by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in a new report that reckons all British families will be worse off by the end of the decade, and with those on the lowest incomes hit twice as hard as middle and high earners. JRF said, we estimate the average household disposable incomes after housing costs will remain £400 a year below 2020 levels in April. By April 2030, households will be a further £1,400 worse off on average than they are today, a 3% fall. The UK Resolution Foundation also said Britain's outlook for real disposable incomes is bleak, especially for poorer households, after the benefit cuts announced at the spring statement. It is now likely disposable income in the UK will have fallen for 10 straight years in 2030. Reeves justifies her approach because there is a fiscal hole between government revenue and spending. It stands at 10 billion a year and it has to be filled. I find that a bit rich, given that she is to blame for it. She dug the hole with her first budget by making no tax changes, no rise in corporate profits, and no wealth tax on the filthy rich. What she did then in her spring statement was to introduce a range of cuts that will affect the poorest people in Britain. It should have been very different. For example, she could have introduced a wealth tax of 2% a year on those owning more than 10 million, which would raise £24 billion a year, which would have easily covered her fiscal hole and sent out a very clear message to the people that voted Labour. Instead, she favoured more unprecedented cuts as a solution to balance the government's books. She decided to ignore the risk of widening inequality and made the poorest suffer the most. Her most cruel spending plan is to slash benefits by £5 billion by 2930. These are the benefits to assist some of the most vulnerable people in society, the disabled, those unable to work, and those who are poor. That economically illiterate disgrace will, according to the Department for Work and Pensions, drive at least 250,000 people, including 50,000 children, deeper into poverty. In defending these cuts, as the dedicated neoliberal that she is, Reeves said, "I am absolutely certain that our reforms, instead of punishing people into poverty or pushing them into poverty, are going to get people into work. And we know that if you move from welfare into work, you are much less likely to be in poverty." Reeves should listen to the Resolution Foundation, which declared supporting disabled people isn't just a moral duty, it is an economic necessity. If she really wanted to boost our economy, she could invest in housing, health, education, transport, infrastructure, anything that would give a real boost to our economy, provide real benefits for people and create jobs at the same time. Instead, Reeves is only going to ensure a deeper widening of inequality apart from in the one sector that she clearly loves. Military spending will be increased by an extra 2.2 billion. Overseas aid for the most vulnerable is being slashed, while subsidies for British arms exports to overseas buyers are to be increased. A Labour government with an unprecedented majority in Parliament is penalising the most poor and vulnerable in society and doing nothing to the rich. What hypocrites they are. Following the autumn statement, Steer Karma announced several milestones to supplement what he called government missions. The growth mission had a new target of higher living standards in every region of the country. This was to be measured by the OBR estimate of real households' disposable incomes. And, I quote Smarmer, "We target the fastest growth in the G7, so working people have more money in their pocket." He then had the audacity to state the burden of the cost of living crisis no longer intruding on the joy of family life. JRF stated that their modelling shows that the distributional picture is even tougher, with inequality set to rise as real disposable incomes fall around twice as fast for lower income households compared with the middle and the top. It is bad enough that a Labour government would prioritise the poorest to suffer huge losses. But it was in Parliament on the 25th of February that Starmer said, "Starting today, this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward so that we will reach that level in 2027. And we will maintain for the rest of the Parliament this." Let me spell that out. That means spending 13.4 billion more on defence every year from 2027. End the quote. In my book, Keir relying on the inefficient, greedy and rotten arms industry to boost the economy is not a badge of honour. nor is cutting foreign aid to the poorest in the world just to fund Labour's war fetish. Reeves recently bragged that it is Labour's intention to make Britain a defence industrial superpower. Labour is clearly proud to be a warmongering party of the military-industrial complex. Instead of defending the poor, the vulnerable, the oppressed in Britain and all around the world, all the leading capitalist states are abandoning social programmes at home and aid projects abroad, all to fund American companies in the military-industrial complex. And let's not forget, some of whom are the biggest carbon polluters in the world. Smarmer and Reeves are banging the drum of a class war against the working class, pensioners, low-income families, the sick and the disabled, all whilst imposing cuts and restrictions in social security benefits. We must increase all our efforts to get this message heard and the whole of this war agenda opposed. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Thank you very much. Okay, so and our last speaker, Helen, a moment. Helen Mercer is a retired teacher and lecturer. She campaigns against the privatisation and dismantling of the National Health Service. And she's going to look at how some of these international developments are going to impact what's happening in the NHS. Over to you, Helen.
Right, thank you very much, Maggie, and thank you for inviting me. Of course, the problems of the NHS predate Trump by a long way. And I think there are two main issues facing the NHS. One has very long historic roots, going back at least 4 and possibly 5 decades, which are going to be in the news because of Trump, but they go back a long way. The other is of relatively recent origin. It's the poverty that's being induced since the start of the Ukraine war with the increased arms expenditure and Starmer's fiscal rules. So I'm going to take the long-term one first, and that is privatisation. And I think it's very important that people realise, particularly when they're talking about arms expenditure and cuts to welfare, that it is not cuts to spending in the NHS is not the main problem in the NHS. It is a problem, but it is one tactic in a grand strategy of privatising it. Privatising public utilities by stealth, as they put it, was first mooted in a Tory Central Office paper of 1977, and the NHS got a mention then. 10 years later, how it was to be privatised was outlined in a paper by Oliver Letwin and John Redwood, and all governments have since then been trying to outdo one another on how far they can privatise it. Now, it does affect the NHS because the shortage of funds and privatisation encourages NHS bodies to seek out private contractors who will offer cheaper provision. But they can only do that by providing poorer quality care, low wages and conditions. And also the general squeeze, together with an irrational and fragmented service that privatisation creates, is also forcing people into private healthcare. So there is a contribution. But behind the NHS logo, privatisation is rampant. Ancillary services in hospitals, such as catering, laundry, portering, cleaning, are almost entirely privatised, mainly through PFI. And this PFI also imposes other costs on hospitals, representing sometimes up to 20% of the hospital's budget, and money which is paid mainly to offshore investment consortia. Private contracts are extending well into the ambulance services, urgent care centres, GP practices, pathology, ongoing care provision, such as musculoskeletal services and sexual health. Half of all mental health beds are run by private companies. The private sector is becoming the dominant provider of cataract surgery and hip replacements, which are straightforward, relatively risk-free operations with a tidy profit. Just recently, the government awarded a £2.5 billion contract to the private sector to take 1 million people off the waiting lists. Instead of increasing NHS capacity to deal with the waiting lists, The private sector will now have to poach NHS-trained staff to fulfil their contracts. That is the effect of privatisation. It leaches NHS resources out of the NHS. Recently, a firm owned by Virgin Health won a £1.8 billion contract to become the monopoly provider of community provided services for Somerset and Wiltshire. KKR, a big landholding company, has just bought a package of a hospital's land worth £1.6 billion. Moreover, everything now is in place for further privatisation. England has been divided up into 42 regions or integrated care systems, and a national health service no longer really exists. Each integrated care system has about 1 to 2 million people, and it's run by integrated care boards, on whom representatives of private companies are appointed. And it is these, not NHS England, who will now decide who is cared for in the area, how much they can be cared for, and crucially, who is going to get the contracts. Funding is an issue, but we need to realise that billions could be saved by ending privatisation. One estimate shows that 30% odd of the cost of private contracts goes in dividends and the transaction costs of running the contracts. The second issue are problems related to the war. And first of all, I want to say something about the massive increase in energy costs. And these relate specifically to the long-standing opposition by the United States to European reliance on Russian or Soviet energy. It dates back to the Reagan era and the sanctions imposed on countries which in any way supplied the Trans-Siberian pipeline, which the Soviet Union was building at the time in the early 1980s. And I wrote an article for the Morning Star just recently, and I showed that the energy prices rose so much that the government had to subsidise energy prices because they feared the public reaction. According to the budget report of spring 1984, the government cushioned the effect of the rising cost of living, introducing support worth £94 billion over 2 years and paying almost half of households' energy bills from October 2022 to June 2023. 94 billion. That is way higher than the cost of military and other support for Ukraine. And we need to incorporate that figure into the total costs of the war. Nevertheless, high energy costs are still with us, although they have fallen drastically since then, but they are likely still to be about 60% above what they were in 2020. Adding into that the welfare benefit cuts that Bob has so clearly outlined, which are a direct effect of boosting arms expenditure. These are cruel cuts, and these and the energy rises, they all increase the trend towards poverty and health inequality. There is bad housing, which provides cold, damp houses, mold-ridden, and bad food. These create or exacerbate respiratory, cardiovascular diseases, mental health problems, and they also are implicated in slowing child development. Excess deaths are associated with both privatisation and cold houses and malnutrition. For the first time since 1900, the rise in life expectancy has stalled over the last 10 years, and has actually fallen for women in deprived areas. Now, there's going to be, to come back to the issue of the NHS and Trump, there's going to be, in my view, a lot of kabuki theatre around negotiations with Trump over the tariffs. And we're being told that Trump will want, and probably true, we'll say that, that Trump will open up the NHS to US healthcare companies. That's what they're going to give to Trump in order to reduce the tariffs. But we didn't need Trump to open up the NHS to private companies. We did it all on our own. What we have in Britain is companies like Palantir, which hold our NHS data, Centene, running GP practices, urgent care centres and other things, and of course United Healthcare itself, for whom Simon Stevens, who then became head of NHS England, used to work. So I've got a proposal for NCWB. I propose that we stand up very resolutely, just like China, to Trump's tariffs, And we say, well, no, we're not going to open up the NHS to private firms. There's already plenty of opportunity for private US companies to come into Britain and take over private contracts in the NHS. Unless you withdraw your tariffs, we will sanction US healthcare companies operating in the NHS. It's just a thought, Maggie, just a thought.
Thanks very much, Helen. That's really good. Thanks. That has been a super panel of speakers. Thanks, everybody. That's been really great. I'm just sorry we didn't have more time for you all, but I think we've got a good feel of, just the extent of what the US administration can, how it can affect us, throughout the world.